Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. It is 10:06, April 28th, almost beginning of May. Crazy. May 1st is Friday. It's pretty nuts. Tomorrow we have a show with Osmia at the Aphodian Theater, which I'm pretty psyched about. Get to play with some very cool bands that I am really looking forward to seeing, and it's 7 o'clock. It's at the Aphodian, which is a really cool venue in Portland. We played there last year with Osmia when we did the first tour, which was last about a year ago now. That the last date of the tour that we did with that I did with Osmia was at the Aphodian. Very cool venue. It's in Portland. It's there's a lot of good options down there, at least for food and drink, and obviously the parking situation is actually pretty good there too. And I went to the Fodian to I went to a show there to see one of my favorite bands in the state. Like around when was that? That was like December. I went to a really killer show there, and so really looking forward to tomorrow's show. Very cool. And one of probably my favorite band in the state, Cushing, which is a phenomenal band. They played at the Euphodian in December with another fantastic band called Ann Anderson. It was a really great show, but it was kind of a bummer because there were a bunch of sound issues. So the sound was like kind of a shit show. The show itself was really great, but anyway. And then Friday this week, which is May 1st, will be um, a quantum show. We're going to be playing at Lucia's Spirits. We're going to be playing. It's in Rockland. Lucia's Spirits is right on, I think it's Main Street in Rockland. And it's kind of like across the street. Anybody who is watching this video or lives in Maine or knows the area, Lucia's Spirits is a tiny little bar, very cool little spot, right kind of across the street from Ada's Kitchen in Rockland, kind of right on the main stretch there. But really cool little hidden place, but very nice, very sweet little spot. And we're gonna be playing there with a band that Quantum and I think and Osmia also. We played a festival last year. I think it was one of the dates of the tour. We played this festival in Providence, Rhode Island, and there was a band there called So Over It. Really great punk band. They have this real cool kind of like proggy edge to their sound. It's a power trio, and they're based out of Providence, Rhode Island. Very cool people, very cool band. And then in the fall of last year now or this year, but last year they came up to Maine and we played a show together at Hey Sailor. I did a show with them with Quantum. So I'm going to be playing with them, and there's going to be a few other bands, and it's going to be at Lush Spirits in Rockland. I think the show starts at 7. So really excited about that. This will also be my kind of first, I guess official go of it, for what it's worth. Carrying on as Quantum, but as just me. My friend Mike Whitehead, who has played in the band for a crazy amount of time, 10 years already, decided to kind of move on. So I'm carrying on with the band Quantum, and it's just going to be me, moving forward. So the rest of the shows coming up after that will be just me. And yeah, we'll see how it goes. And it starts at 7 o'clock. And then other shows I have coming up with Quantum will be, we're going to be playing back at Opera House Video with my friend Ronnie. A couple weeks after that, we played there maybe like a month or 2 months ago, and it was really a really good time. So we're going to do a show again at Opera House Video that will be coming up in a few weeks, and I'll be doing a bunch of promotion for that. We do this kind of the way we've been doing those shows. We did a couple of them where we're kind of doing this round robin thing where our sets are we're kind of playing off of each other a little bit. It's not like a traditional set or gig where, typically a band will play one set, 40 minutes or whatever, or an hour, and then the next band comes on and just plays. We kind of set it up. It was kind of my idea from a show that I had seen, where we're kind of just rotating in and out, and like playing a song, say 10, 15 minutes, and trying to interact with each other and play off of each other, and then also playing together too at some point. So it was really fun. We did that a few months ago, and it was during a festival that they had in Belfast. So there was extra people in town. So we're going to be doing that again at Opera House Video, world famous Opera House Video, the only video rental place in the entire state. Really, really awesome spot. One of my homes, away from home, like Bull Moose music. And then we'll be doing another Quantum show coming up later this spring, summertime. I'll be doing a show again at the Camden Library, the Amphitheater, which is an amazing venue. It's a gig that since Quantum has been a band, we've been doing every year, usually every summer. So we'll be back. I'll be back there doing that, and I love that setting. It's such a beautiful little space. The acoustics are great. It's usually a pretty chill kind of gig. We usually play like an hour and a half to 2 hours, but it's a lot of fun, and it's kind of been part of our tradition as a band for a long time. So we'll be doing that again this summer, and then we'll be doing a show at the Poor Farm, which is another gig or spot that we've done for a long time. Actually, we've played. I don't know. We pretty much play. I guess you could say we pretty much play at the Poor Farm every summer. It's kind of been a tradition, I guess, and that's been a lot of fun. We've played out on the deck a lot of the times, and then if it rains, we've played inside. But usually, playing out on the deck is a lot of fun, weather permitting and things like that. So we'll be back there with Quantum, and there'll be all the shows up that I'm talking about, or just kind of briefly mentioning. I will there'll be a bunch of promotion and stuff for the shows and all that good stuff. And then we got another show coming up which is pretty new venue. It would be our first time for us to play there, but there's a newer-ish venue in Belfast called the Belfast Commons, which is like an art space, a little bit of a performance space, and it's right in downtown Belfast. We're going to be playing there with my great friend Halseyk, who is just an amazing musician, and we've played a lot of shows together. We actually played a show at Hey Sailor fairly recently, so we'll be doing a double duty show there, which will be a lot of fun. And then we're going to do another show. We'll be back at Hey Sailor, which is such a great venue. We'll be back there in July with Travis Lloyd. We did a show with Travis in December, and he's an amazingly talented guy. I'm going to actually be playing double duty because I'm going to be playing drums with Travis as well, so that will be a trip. So very much looking forward to that show. And then we have some shows coming up that are out of state. We're going to be playing at Auspicious Brew in New Hampshire, which is a very, very cool venue. That's going to be coming up. I think that's in August. And then we have another show coming up in Pennsylvania at Rytone, which is a really great, awesome venue. So, and then there's a few other things I'm working on that are potentially coming up, or that I'm working on. We might be back at the Pride Festival. We played at the Pride Festival last year in Rockland, so that's something we might be doing again, trying to work out the details as far as scheduling goes, but we'll see. So there'll probably be some more dates coming up. So yeah, looking forward to these shows. And again, these will be just will be just me by my lonesome. So we'll see how things go. Anyway, I've been watching a lot of movies, surprise, surprise, and I kind of started a new series. I'm always kind of brainstorming, thinking of new ideas for this channel as far as new videos, trying to always bring variety. And recently I started doing this new series because now I have a VHS player. I have a VHS player. I had vacation last week from school, so I had a bunch of time free, and I realized I had actually gotten this free VCR slash DVD player, actually through Opera House Video last year. I got it for free, and I remember, it was like a year ago, and I had it, and I ended up throwing it, putting it in my basement. It was in my car for a while, then I put it in my basement, and I literally forgot that I even had it. And then I had, vacation, and I was like, oh wait, I forgot that I had that. So I figured, why not? And I hadn't tested it out, to see if it was still working, but it looked like it was brand new when I got it. It was literally just sitting out there at this yard sale or the street sale that they sometimes do at Opera House Video, where they sell a lot of movies and things like that. It's a really awesome thing. I'm hoping that they'll do more of them this year. And I picked up. They had this VCR VHS tape player slash DVD player for free, and I was like, oh shit! So I literally snagged it up as soon as they put it out. I snagged it up, threw it in my car, and so last week I hooked it up, and it works. So I have been watching. I haven't in the last few days or so, but I've been watching and busting out some of my old VHS tapes. So I've done a couple of videos on some of my VHS movies, and it's been a lot of fun revisiting. The quality is not great of VHS, but it's fun and it's more out of nostalgia. But I have some good movies. I have a shit ton of VHS tapes. So I figured, why not? And it's been a lot of fun. I've done, I think, at least 2 shows for this channel on my VHS tapes. I'm entitling this kind of new series the VHS Corner. So this next video that I'm going to be doing, today's video, is going to be on a music video, and I have a pretty funny and pretty long history with this band, and the kind of the timing of when I got into them, the albums that I got into to them, when I first heard them. And then also, this is a band too that changed a lot later on in their career. So it was just kind of interesting timing. And I was in high school when I got into this band. And these guys are, when it comes to death metal, black metal, extreme metal in general, but especially death metal and especially black metal, I think they are probably one of the most important bands to influence and create this kind of new style. My trajectory as a kid getting into metal and rock was Kiss. Kiss was the starting point. It was first, Kiss was the band, like it was, and this story is similar for like millions and millions of other kids, of course. Kiss was the first one, and then it was Ozzy, of course. I got into Ozzy before I got into Black Sabbath, which is kind of weird, but got into Ozzy first. And then from there, I got into Iron Maiden, became a huge Iron Maiden fan, really, really into Judas Priest. All these bands I still love too. I still listen to these bands, especially like old Judas Priest. I really love their older stuff from like the 70s, early 80s. So Judas Priest, and then I got into Black Sabbath, became a massive Sabbath fan. And then when I started to get into more extreme music, it was Metallica. Like either when I first heard Ride the Lightning or Master of Puppets. And again, this was the days of cassettes. So I bought all of these bands, their albums, and what have you on cassette. And it's funny, I still have about 95% of these tapes that I got when I was a kid. I still have them. And I actually have a working tape player. So every now and then I'll bust them out and throw those tapes in. And it's a trip watching or listening to this stuff now. But as far as like getting into, heavier music or more extreme, it was definitely, Metallica was kind of that band, as far as getting me into like thrash metal, Master Puppets, Ride the Lightning, Kill 'Em All. And then started getting into, from there I got into a lot of the other thrash metal bands that were happening at the time, bands like Exodus, Testament, Violence, things like that. And then it was the band that got me into even more extreme. That was probably even the biggest kind of pivotal point for me was Slayer. And that particular the album that definitely did it was Rain and Blood. When I got Rain and Blood, I think Rain and Blood was the first album I ever heard of Slayer, and that was the album that, for what it's worth, kind of changed my life as far as like getting way into. That was the gateway album for me, that where I got into death metal. When that album came out, was like, I don't know, it was 86, 87. It was the most extreme music I had heard up until that point. It was really dark. It was the first time I heard a band that had quote unquote satanic lyrics. And it was the darkest thing, it was the fastest thing, it was the heaviest music I had ever heard. I remember as a kid listening to that album, it would give me goosebumps. And right at that time was when the Tampa, Florida scene was happening. We were, all of the classic death metal bands came out of Tampa. Obituary, Deicide, Morbid Angel. I mean, the list is endless. And it just exploded. And then Cannibal Corpse was coming out. It was insane. And right at that time, I also started getting into bands that had been around for a long time and that were actually very influential on a lot of these bands, but kind of got into them a little bit later. But right as I started getting into bands like Morbid Angel, which even to this day, Morbid Angel is my favorite death metal band of all time. Still, I still listen to them, and I got a chance to see them in concert about 2 or 3 years ago, and it was amazing. And I don't know if they're going to come back around, but I'm super glad I got a chance to see them at least. But right at that time, I also got into older groups that were kind of still around, but they were, later on I started realizing how much of an influence they had on these bands. And bands like Bathory, of course. A massive, massive band for me was that it was discovering, like, it was funny. It was right after I discovered Rain of Blood, I started getting into darker and heavier music. But it was Bathory, Venom, one of my favorite bands of all time. I still love Venom. Huge, huge influence for me. And today's show, the band I'm going to be talking about, although this is at a very different stage for them, is Celtic Frost. And right as I got into like those bands, I got into the Tampa Bay scene and all of the death metal bands that were coming out, and I got totally obsessed with the whole death metal scene. And then after a few years of that, I eventually had a friend who turned me on to bands like Burzum and Mayhem and Immortal. And that really changed my trajectory, because then I got way into black metal. And black metal, out of all of the extreme music that's out there, when it comes to heavy music, you have like your classic heavy metal, you have your American heavy metal bands, and then of course the really influential British heavy metal bands, thrash metal, death metal, which I still a massive, massive fan of death metal. But the music that really kind of changed my whole thing was when I got into black metal. It was like at a different level. And it hit me a little bit deeper. And when it comes to like heavy music, extreme music, and the genres attributed to that, I have to say black metal is my favorite style. Even though I love death metal to death, black metal is the style for me that is kind of my ultimate. That's where I get the most enjoyment from. And the band I'm going to be talking about today is Celtic Frost. And Celtic Frost is got to be. They are one of the most iconic bands. Their first few albums they put out were just so influential on the black metal scene, and a lot of the bands. I think the bands that were probably the most influential on creating the black metal sound for me, and again, everybody has their own opinions, but I would say Celtic Frost, without a doubt, maybe even the most influential. Venom, of course, huge, huge influence. Obviously, Bathory, pretty much, you could say created that sound. When you listen to early Bathory, it's kind of that sound, like that, the high pitched vocals, the tremolo vocals, like trebly kind of guitar tones, the real kind of dark atmosphere, kind of the little bit of the ambience that's in black metal. But so, you know, so influential. I mean, so definitely Celtic Frost, without a doubt, Venom, Bathory, and then I think another band would be Merciful Fate, another massively influential band. And there's other bands, there's other things, but I think those four bands probably were and are the most influential into creating the black metal scene. Whether they're bands, you had the Norwegian scene that was going on, that, and then you also had the kind of the American death metal scene going on, and you had a bunch of bands coming out in Greece. I mean, really, a lot of bands throughout Europe. But for me, it was my first exposure to black metal. It was the Norwegian scene, and then I got into the American kind of black metal scene shortly after, and then a lot of the European bands that were coming out. And then even bands in Canada. I mean, bands like Blasphemy, and then you had like the kind of the war metal vibe, and so many great bands that came out of Finland. I mean, Beherit. So there's like an endless amount of different bands. But for me, the starting point was definitely the Norwegian black metal scene. That was my first exposure. But Celtic Frost, I think, was, without Celtic Frost and especially their first few albums, oh shit, I don't think, you wouldn't have, I don't think the sound of what black metal is now even would be the same. And that being said, Tom G. Warrior, who is basically the leader of and main songwriter for Celtic Frost, his, that I mean, again, such an influential band. Tom G. Warrior's previous band, Hellhammer, another band, super influential. I believe they put out one or two albums, and then it transitioned into what Celtic Frost became. But their early records, I mean, that band, Hellhammer, is a tremendous, huge, huge influence on the black metal scene. Some would almost argue that Hellhammer might have been even more influential than Celtic Frost. But again, the legacy of what that band did, or those bands did, and even the other bands I mentioned, is insane. But that being said, it's really funny because when I got into Celtic Frost, it was, again, that transition, after discovering Rain and Blood, hearing that for the first time, and it just blowing my mind. Getting into that was the transition that opened me into getting into the black metal scene, or I should say death metal, and then black metal, but then also getting way into the bands that kind of influenced more or less that first wave of black metal, and bands that were, like when I got into Slayer and eventually into bands like Morbid Angel. Obviously, Celtic Frost, Bathory, all of that stuff came out a few years before and was very influential on that music. And I remember when I first got into Celtic Frost and Venom, all of those bands were still very much out and active and playing, and with the original lineups. But Celtic Frost at that time, when I got into them, it was a little bit later in their career, and they were in a kind of a weird, funky transition period. And so I was way into them, and I remember buying this videotape, and it's Celtic Frost live at the Hammersmith Odeon from 1989, and that's this bad boy here. Yep. And as you could tell on the cover, which might be hard to see, they Times You Were is kind of he's rocking the spandex and the hairspray. So the thing that was really funny was they put out around the late 80s. Celtic Frost went through this phase of where they put out this album called Cold Lake, and 80 the late 80s. That was when the glam metal scene was huge. The cock rock. You had Faster Pussycat. Shit, there was so many Poison. There were so many glam metal bands that were huge. Everybody had the tight spandex, the leather pants, the big hair, makeup, the whole thing. Like that was LA Guns. That scene was so huge. So Celtic Frost were trying to, I think, they were trying to fit in with that scene, I think, but their music was still kind of in the on the darker side of things, but their music kind of took on the shape of where Cold Lake is essentially like their glam metal album, if you will. And it came out right during the time, like even in I think this video, Tom G. Warrior's wearing a Faster Pussycat album, which was Faster Pussycat, I think, was one of the bigger kind of glam metal bands in LA, so it's pretty funny. And he has the spandex and the whole thing. Yeah, and, when you go back, and so when I got into Celtic Frost, that was what they were doing at that time. It was Cold Lake. And this album was fucking hated by people. This phase was despised by most of the metal community because, they were looked at as being total sellouts and all this stuff. But, I will say, revisiting this, and again, I watched this last week, and it was fucking wild. Like, it's super funny, and, it's total Spinal Tap. But I will say, like, some of this music, especially from the phase of Cold Lake or that period, because they pretty much broke up right after. And now Tom G. Warrior, because that's the thing now, all of these older bands that have been, the legacy thing has come back, so a lot of these bands are touring again. And Tom G. Warrior has been touring, various projects and has been doing a few Celtic Frost shows, and they traditionally play like the older stuff. But I remember when Cold Lake came out, it was not a big success, and I think they kind of broke up shortly after. But they totally went in this glam direction. But revisiting this tape, and it's a 2-hour concert, it's hilarious. Like, totally brings back crazy memories because the first couple albums that I got into were way darker. But I will say, revisiting some of this stuff, and when they play the Cold Lake material, it's not that bad. It's actually, it definitely is very LA glammy, kind of very LA glam inspired. But it's kind of heavy. It's kind of heavier than I remember it being. The music is actually pretty good. It has like a combination of a little bit of their classic kind of Celtic Frost sound, and I'm going to get into the early albums, but it was just funny timing because when I got into them, they were going through this phase, and yet I was like totally into their first few albums and even Hellhammer, but they were totally into this glam thing. But revisiting it, I mean, again, it's kind of more, it's a 2-hour concert. It's at the Hammersmith Odeon, which is a legendary venue. I think it's still around, and this is from '89, which is fucking crazy. And it's a 2-hour concert, and they play a lot of new stuff. Well, not new stuff, but they play a lot of stuff on from the album Cold Lake. But they also play a lot of classic Celtic Frost, and it's kind of cool. It's the older stuff sounds really badass on here, and I will have to say their later stuff, the Glampier, the Cold Lake stuff, is not bad. It's actually, it's not that bad, and it's funny because I remember as a kid that album being so torn up by, everybody hated that album. Most of the friends and kids that I knew that were into metal were, way into Celtic Frost. I mean, how could you not be? But most people that I remember, kids that friends or people that I knew hated this album, just hated it. And I remember they got just torn a new asshole by critics, by fans. And I remember there being interviews with Tom G. Warrior, kind of, where he would talk about the backlash, and he was kind of defending what they were doing. It's kind of interesting. But the music, as bad as it kind of is, or, during, and especially during that time, how bad it was, ridiculed, even made fun of, music's not that bad. It's definitely got that glam rock edge, but it's still got that Celtic Frost kind of darkness or DNA in it. So it's got, it's not Poison. It's not, I wouldn't say it's like that, or it's not like LA Guns or anything like that. Like that music, because that was a product of its time, and I get it. A band has to adapt at the times, what have you. But I mean, a lot of people forget that, when Pantera started, they were a glam metal band. If you ever see old photos of their first couple of tours and their first album or EPs, that stuff was pure glam metal. So, and that was, they were a product of the time. So, I get that. But I just remember it being really funny, growing up, listening, getting really into Celtic Frost, buying all their cassettes, especially their early stuff. But they were still very much a band, and Cold Lake had just come out, and I was just like, "What the fuck? Is this the same band?" And I liked I don't know. I mean, it was so long ago, and I remember kind of liking Cold Lake, but then I would always go back to the old school stuff because that was where it was at, of course. But it's grown on me, and well, it's not something I've listened to a lot, but revisiting this VHS tape is hilarious. It's definitely Spinal Tap. It's definitely a Spinal Tap thing going on. But I will say the music is actually not that bad. Not that bad. And I don't think the hate that they got was totally justified. They sound pretty good as a band. This lineup, Tom G. Warrior went through a lot of different lineups through the years, with Celtic Frost and what have you. And he's got other projects and other bands. He's still out there and he's still prolific. But, it was a different time. And it's crazy. I mean, when you think of the albums that Celtic Frost put out, they put out 20 studio albums, which I didn't realize that. Like, that's crazy. Morbid Tales was the album that I got. Well, cassette, I should say. That was the first cassette I ever got from Celtic Frost. That was it. And then also another classic album of theirs was Into the Pandemonium. Like those two albums I had on cassette, and I would listen to them all the time. And then another two EPs that they put out was Emperor's Return, which was an EP, and also Tragic Serenades. That was those four studio albums and those EPs were like cereal for me. I would eat them every day, and I was obsessed with those cassettes. And I never really, they did carry on after Cold Lake. They put out a few other albums after that. I mean, Cold Lake came out in '88. Morbid Tales came out. Well, actually, there was a remastered version in '99. But Morbid Tales came out in '84. Two Megatherion 85. And they actually put out a few other albums after Cold Lake. Vanity, Nemesis, and then also Prototype in 2002. And I believe that was, I believe that was one of the last official studio album. And in 2002, Celtic Frost put out a giant box set of all of their albums. So the Sign of the Usurper that came out in 2002. But the popularity, especially with those albums I mentioned, I mean, just monumental. And then going back, and the previous band started by Tom G. Warry again. Some people have said in the metal community, and it's a pretty, I can kind of agree with it, but some people have said that the influence of Celtic Frost, obviously that's never in question, but some people have said that the previous band that Tom G. Warrior had, Hellhammer, is even more influential. And you do see that a lot. I mean, it's really, really hard. Those bands, every time I see an interview with, especially a member of a band, of a classic or really fantastic black metal band, you'd be hard pressed to not hear, in these particular interviews, of when maybe during interview it comes to, the interview will ask them what were the bands that influenced you, and they every time, like, you always hear Venom, you always hear you you always hear Celtic Frost. You always hear Bathory, of course, but you really do hear a lot of Hellhammer, and there has been people who have said that Hellhammer, is even more influential. Hellhammer's even a little bit, you could say a little bit more raw, a little bit more dark, a little bit, definitely. And I think they were a very interesting band because they were very experimental, and also Celtic Frost obviously definitely pushed the boundaries, too. They weren't like Tunji Warrior was not interested in kind of like putting out the same album, and he kind of reinvented what the band was a lot. So that was something I always really loved. But Hellhammer was a tremendous band. They put out Satanic Rites in '83, The Triumph of Death, '83, Death Fiend, Apocalyptic Raids, which is a massively influential album, in '84, which was an EP. So yeah, just tremendous. But I will say they on this cassette they play a lot of stuff from Cold Lake on here, but they also play a lot of the old school stuff. So it's pretty cool. They do a pretty good job blending the the different styles, and the different records, the different phases of what Celtic Frost was. Because they went into some really radical, different directions and controversial for some fans. But this cassette is great. I mean, shit, I used to watch this, and it was always funny because I was so enamored with Celtic Frost at a young age, and I knew like this newer phase that they were going through was like not the same, but I still would watch this, and I really loved this cassette. I used to watch this all the time. I don't think there. I'm sure there are, but I'm sure there are concerts and videos or DVDs, Blu-rays, maybe of Celtic Frost concerts like from the classic record album days. I haven't come across. I haven't really looked, but it was just funny timing because listening to like albums like Morbid Tales and being obsessed with that, Tragic Serenades, and just being so enamored with that music, playing the shit out of those tapes as a kid. But they were at in the Cold Lake phase, which is so radically different. And I remember buying this and being like, whoa, what the fuck? But it grew on me. But I will say, watching them perform in this concert is pretty fun. They sound pretty good. I will say they sound pretty good. It's definitely total, there's many Spinal Tap moments. But the variety that they play, they play a lot of old stuff, which is very cool. And it does, it does fit in pretty well with, at that point, at that time, with the new material and the music that is so radically different. But it's super fun being able to revisit it. I mean, I literally, this was a cassette I used to watch all the fucking time. And I don't know, I probably wouldn't buy this or get an upgrade of it on Blu-ray. Maybe it exists, I don't know. But for what it is, it's pretty fun. And I ended up, when I had, which was it last week, when I hooked up my DVD VHS player and suddenly it was working and it works great, perfect condition. This was one of the first tapes that I watched. And I remember sitting on my couch or sitting in my bed, because I have my Blu-ray player that I have, where my main kind of the main part of or section for Film Fanatic headquarters is in my living room where I shoot these videos. This is like the main spot of where I watch my Blu-rays. But my VHS player is in my bedroom, and where my bed is, so the TV is set up on a pretty big table or a mantle, and then the VHS player is right next to it. And it's pretty comfy. I will say it's super comfortable. It's even more comfortable in there than it is in here. It's kind of funny. So, yeah, it's funny. But I remember when I first got it hooked up last week, this was one of the first tapes I dug out and I watched it. And I watched it right through, and it's about 2 hours, but it's hilarious. It's fun. I enjoyed it. Yeah. So thanks again. This is another video for the uh, new series for VHS Corner. Celtic Frost, live at the Hammersmith Odeon in 80. What did I say it was? 89? Yeah, crazy. Have a good day. Peace.